In a quiet suburban driveway, a 68-year-old grandmother was about to discover decades of family memories scattered like garbage. What started as her weekly Sunday dinner visit took a shocking turn when she came face to face with 40 years of irreplaceable photographs thrown away like trash. Eleanor Matthews wasn't your typical retired librarian. For 30 years, she had spent her life cataloging and preserving precious memories, known for her meticulous care in maintaining family, history, and stories that connected generations. When she encountered black garbage bags filled with wedding albums, baby pictures, and military service photos destined for the curb, she had no idea she was walking into a family crisis that would tear them apart before bringing them back together. Eleanor's systematic withdrawal from her family's daily life that would lead to her son's wife learning the true cost of the space she desperately craved. What began as a daughter-in-law's need for minimalist order would become a profound lesson about the difference between emptiness and room for love. The Matthews family would never be the same after discovering that some spaces are harder to close than they are to create. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Eleanor Matthews pulled her aging Honda into the familiar driveway, the evening sun casting long shadows across the manicured lawn that Vanessa maintained with military precision. The garbage cans sat at the curb. Pickup wasn't until Tuesday, but Vanessa always had them out early. Everything in its place, everything scheduled, everything controlled. Something was different today. Black garbage bags clustered around the usual bins, more than the weekly collection warranted. Eleanor's practiced librarian eye caught the corner of something familiar protruding from one bag, the burgundy leather binding of her father's photo album, the one she'd carefully restored after his passing 20 years ago. Her hands went cold. She approached the bags with the measured pace of someone processing an impossibility. The first bag revealed what her mind refused to accept: decades of family photographs scattered like discarded receipts. Her wedding album, 43, years of marriage to Robert, lay water-stained and torn. Pictures of David's first steps, his graduation, his wedding day. Images of family Christmas mornings, summer vacations, quiet Sunday afternoons when life felt whole and permanent. All of it. Gone. "Oh, there you are." Vanessa's voice carried from the front door, bright and untroubled. She wore one of her perfectly coordinated athleisure outfits, not a hair out of place despite what she'd clearly spent the day doing. "We're running a bit behind on dinner prep." Eleanor straightened slowly, a photograph of Robert holding infant David clutched in her trembling fingers. Water damage had blurred Robert's smile into something unrecognizable. "What is this?" "Spring cleaning." Vanessa's tone remained cheerful, almost proud. "Well, more like spring purging. David and I decided we really needed to create some space in the house. All that clutter was making everything feel so cramped." Clutter. The word came out flat, devoid of emotion. Eleanor had learned long ago that the most dangerous feelings required the calmest delivery. "I know it seems like a lot, but honestly, most of those photos were duplicates anyway. And with everything being digital now, it just didn't make sense to keep taking up all that storage space." Vanessa gestured toward the house as if she were describing a successful renovation project. "You should see how much more open the living room feels now." Eleanor's gaze swept across the bags again. 40 years of marriage, David's entire childhood, family reunions with relatives now past, Robert's military service photos, their honeymoon, the last Christmas before Robert's diagnosis. "These aren't duplicates." Her voice carried the authority of someone who had spent decades cataloging and preserving information. "Many of these are the only copies that exist." Vanessa's smile flickered, just for a moment. "Well, I'm sure the important ones are still around somewhere. And like I said, we really needed the space." David appeared in the doorway, wiping. His hands on a dish towel, his father's height, his father's gentle eyes, but none of Robert's backbone when it mattered. "Mom, hey, sorry about the mess out there. We've been decluttering all weekend." "Your son's baby pictures are in these." Doug. Eleanor held up a photograph of 2-year-old David on Robert's shoulders, both of them grinning at the camera. The image was creased down the middle where someone had carelessly folded it. David's face went pale. "Oh, we didn't really look through everything. Vanessa was handling the photo organization, and I was dealing with the garage. We agreed we needed to be ruthless about letting go of things that don't serve our current lifestyle," Vanessa interjected, her voice taking on the measured tone she used in client presentations. "I read this amazing article about how physical clutter creates mental clutter, and honestly, Eleanor, some of those albums hadn't been looked at in years." I looked at them. The words came out sharper than Eleanor intended. "Every week, when I babysat Lily, she loves hearing the stories behind the pictures." For the first time, Vanessa's composure cracked slightly. "Lily has plenty of current photos on our phones. She doesn't need all these old. Where are the photo albums?" 6-year-old Lily's voice cut through the tension as she appeared beside her father, her dark hair in the same precise pigtails Vanessa maintained. "Grandma Eleanor, where are all our pictures?" The silence stretched long enough for Eleanor to hear the neighbor's sprinkler system cycling on, the distant sound of a dog barking, the ordinary sounds of a Sunday evening in suburbia. Normal sounds for a moment that was reshaping everything she thought she knew about her family. "We put them away, sweetheart," David said finally, his voice strained, "to make more room for playing." Lily frowned, the expression so much like Robert's when he was puzzling through a problem. "But I like looking at the pictures with Grandma. She tells me stories about when you were little, and about Grandpa Robert, and about when everyone was young." Eleanor knelt beside one of the bags, her arthritis protesting the movement. She began carefully extracting photographs, checking each one for damage. Wedding photos. Robert in his army uniform. David's first day of school. Family portraits spanning 4 decades. "Eleanor, please." Vanessa's voice carried a note of impatience. "Now. Dinner's getting cold, and we can't just leave all that spread out on the lawn." "You're right." Eleanor stood, cradling what photos she could save. "We can't leave them on the lawn. I'll take them." "You don't need to," David started. "I need to," Eleanor said quietly. "Someone needs to." She made 3 trips to her car, loading garbage bags full of water-damaged memories into her back seat and trunk. David helped, his face flushed with what might have been shame or simply embarrassment. Vanessa remained on the porch, checking, her phone with practiced indifference. "Mom, you're still staying for dinner, right?" David asked as Eleanor closed her trunk. "Vanessa made that salmon you like." Eleanor looked at her son, really looked at him. When had he become someone who could stand by while decades of family history got thrown away like old newspapers? When had he stopped being the little boy who used to beg her to tell him stories about his father's childhood, about their family's journey to this quiet suburban life? "I think I need some space," she said, the word space carrying weight that made David wince, "to sort through what's salvageable." Lily ran down from the porch, wrapping her small arms around Eleanor's waist. "Will you come back next Sunday? Will you bring the pictures back?" Eleanor smoothed her granddaughter's hair, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo. "I'll always come back for you, sweetheart, but things might be different for a while." As she drove away, Eleanor's rearview mirror showed the perfect suburban tableau, David and Vanessa standing in their doorway, Lily waving from between them, the empty garbage bags scattered across their pristine lawn like evidence of something that couldn't be undone. The photographs in her back seat rustled with each turn, 40 years of memories reduced to salvage. But as Eleanor's shock began to transform into something colder and more calculated, she realized that Vanessa was about to learn exactly what kind of space a family creates when someone decides they're no longer needed. Some lessons, Eleanor thought as she pulled into her own driveway, required a very personal education. Some lessons, Eleanor thought as she pulled into her own driveway, required a very personal education. The drive home had taken 15 minutes. 15 minutes for 40 years of memories to settle into their new reality, scattered, damaged, discarded. Eleanor sat in her car for a moment after cutting the engine, listening to the photographs rustle in the back seat like fallen leaves. The motion sensor light on her neighbor's porch flickered on, casting harsh shadows across her small front yard. She'd moved to this duplex 3 years ago, after selling the house she'd shared with Robert. Too many rooms for one person, too many memories echoing in empty hallways. The duplex had seemed practical then, close enough to David's family for regular visits, small enough to manage alone, affordable enough to leave her with savings for emergencies and gifts. How naive that seemed now. Eleanor unlocked her front door and began the methodical process of bringing in the bags. Her living room, usually tidy as befitted a former librarian, transformed into something that looked disturbingly like the hoarding chaos Vanessa claimed to despise. Garbage bags lined the walls. Water-damaged photographs covered every surface, the coffee table, the dining table, even the kitchen counters. She worked through the night with the focused intensity she'd once brought to organizing library archives. Paper towels to blot water damage, hairdryer on cool setting to prevent further warping, a magnifying glass to assess which images might be salvageable with proper restoration techniques she'd learned during her 30 years managing the local history collection. The wedding album was the worst casualty. Water had seeped through. The protective sleeves, turning her white dress into a yellowed blur and making Robert's face nearly unrecognizable. But she worked carefully, separating each page, laying them flat on towels. Some photographs were beyond saving, decades reduced to wet pulp and faded chemicals. Others might survive with careful attention. As dawn light filtered through her kitchen window, Eleanor found herself staring at a photograph that had somehow emerged unscathed. Robert teaching 5-year-old David to ride a bicycle. The concentration on both their faces, the way Robert's hand hovered protectively near David's, back without actually touching, ready to catch him if he fell. When had David stopped believing she would catch him? The question crystallized something inside her. This wasn't about sentiment or attachment to material objects, despite what Vanessa believed. This was about the fundamental understanding that some things, some people could be discarded without consequence. That 40 years of marriage, of motherhood, of being the family's keeper of stories and memories, could be reduced to clutter. Eleanor pulled out a yellow legal pad. She'd always thought better with pen and paper, and began making lists. It was a skill that had served her well as a librarian, breaking down complex problems into manageable components, identifying dependencies, mapping relationships between different elements of a system. David and Vanessa. Current dependencies on Eleanor childcare. Tuesday evenings, Vanessa's yoga class. Thursday mornings, David's early meetings. Every other Saturday, their date nights. Emergency babysitting for work conflicts. School pickup when Lily's sick financial support. Lily's dance classes, $120 a month. Emergency fund contributions. Last withdrawal, $800, March car repair. Birthday holiday gifts that exceed their budget grocery supplements during tight months. Household support. Weekly grocery runs for bulk items. Emergency key holder prescription. Pickup for Lily pet care during travel. They didn't have pets now, but she'd watched their cat for 3 years before it died. Emotional labor. Family historian. Memory keeper. Mediator for David's work. Stress Lily's primary source for family stories. Connection to extended family network. Eleanor studied the list. With the same analytical approach she'd once used to evaluate library budget allocations. Each item represented a choice David and Vanessa had made, consciously or unconsciously, to rely on her presence in their lives. They'd built their comfortable routine around her availability, her resources, her willingness to fill gaps in their carefully curated lifestyle. What would happen if those gaps suddenly reappeared? She started a second list: systematic withdrawal. Plan. The approach needed to be methodical rather than emotional. Random acts of anger would only confirm Vanessa's assessment of her as overly sentimental and irrational. But consequences, logical, proportional consequences, those carried a different kind of authority. Phase 1 would be immediate, but subtle. The removal of emergency supports they took for granted. Cancel tomorrow's babysitting without detailed explanation. Remove her spare key from their house. Stop the small financial supplements that smoothed over their budget shortfalls. Phase 2 would be more visible. Withdrawal from regular commitments that structured their weekly routine. No more Thursday morning childcare. No more Saturday evening babysitting for their date nights. Phase 3 would be comprehensive. Complete removal of her presence from their family system. No more holiday coordination. No more emergency fund. No more bridge between Lily and the family stories that connected her to something larger than her parents' minimalist present. Eleanor was deep in planning logistics when she heard footsteps on her front porch. The duplex shared a wraparound porch with her neighbor, but Marcus Williams usually left for his morning walk much earlier. She glanced at the clock. 6:15 a.m. Perhaps his routine had shifted. The knock was soft, almost hesitant. Eleanor looked around at her living room, transformed into what looked like the aftermath of a flood. Photographs everywhere, towels covering every surface, the detritus of a life's worth of memories spread out for triage. Not exactly the impression she preferred to make. But something about the gentleness of that knock suggested that Marcus Williams had already drawn his own conclusions about what might be happening. She opened the door to find her neighbor holding 2 cups of coffee, his graying hair slightly disheveled from the morning breeze. Marcus was perhaps 45, recently divorced according to neighborhood gossip, and unfailingly polite during their brief encounters over the past year. A grief counselor, she'd heard, though he'd never mentioned his work directly. "Morning, Eleanor." His voice carried the careful neutrality of someone accustomed to approaching people in crisis. "Saw your lights on all night. Thought you might need some caffeine." The kindness in the gesture nearly undid her. Eleanor felt her carefully constructed composure waver for the first time since discovering the garbage bags. "That's very thoughtful. I've been sorting through some family photographs." Marcus's eyes took in what was visible of her living room without judgment or intrusion. "Water damage?" "Among other things." Eleanor accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "My daughter-in-law decided our family photos were clutter. Threw them away yesterday." She watched Marcus process this information, saw the moment when professional understanding clicked into place. All of them? 40 years worth. Wedding albums, baby pictures, everything. The words came out steadier than she'd expected. She said they needed space. Marcus leaned against the porch railing, giving her room to talk or not talk as she chose. It was a technique she recognized, the therapeutic pause that invited disclosure without demanding it. "I've been trying to salvage what I can," Eleanor continued. "Some are too damaged. Others might be restored with enough patience." "And you're someone with patience." It wasn't a question. Eleanor found herself almost smiling. 30 years as a librarian. Patience and systematic thinking. Our occupational requirements. Strategic thinking, too, I'd imagine. Marcus's tone was carefully neutral, but something in his expression suggested he'd noted the legal pad on her coffee table, the methodical organization even within the chaos. Eleanor studied her neighbor more carefully. Recently divorced, she'd heard. A man who understood the dissolution of family systems, the way relationships could be dismantled piece by piece until nothing recognizable remained. "They've gotten accustomed to my help," she said finally. "Babysitting, financial support, emergency assistance. I don't think they realize how much they depend on what they consider non-essential. Marcus nodded slowly. Sometimes people need to experience absence to understand presence. The phrase settled into Eleanor's chest like a key finding its lock. Experience absence to understand presence. Yes, that was exactly what this was about. The problem, Eleanor continued, surprising herself with how easily the words came, is that my son avoids conflict, always has. So he'll rationalize whatever his wife wants rather than address the underlying issues, which means the behavior gets reinforced. And your granddaughter? Eleanor's composure cracked slightly at the mention of Lily. She's 6. She doesn't understand why her grandmother's pictures got thrown away, or why the stories she loves are suddenly gone. She's caught in the middle of something that shouldn't be her burden. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, watching the sunrise paint the neighborhood in soft gold. In my experience, he said carefully, the most effective responses to family crises are the ones that create natural consequences rather than artificial punishments. Eleanor felt something click into alignment. Natural consequences. Not revenge, not manipulation, but the logical result of choices already made. If David and Vanessa wanted space from her family history, they could have space from her family support as well. I was planning to call this morning, she said, to cancel babysitting. Vanessa has that yoga class on Tuesday evenings. Will you give a reason? Eleanor considered this. I think I'll say I need time to organize some family materials, which is true. I have 40 years of memories to sort through and decide what's worth preserving. Marcus's smile was slight but approving. Natural consequences often teach lessons more effectively than direct confrontation. They sat in comfortable silence as the neighborhood began to wake up around them. Eleanor found herself noticing details she usually missed in her morning. Routine. The way her neighbor's garden needed weeding, the loose board on the porch step that should be repaired, the comfortable rhythm of Marcus's presence beside her. I should let you get back to your sorting, Marcus said eventually, but he made no immediate move to leave. Actually, Eleanor heard herself saying, would you mind taking a look at something? I could use another perspective on which photographs might be worth the restoration effort. Marcus's expression softened. I'd be honored. As they moved into her living room, Eleanor realized she'd made her first decision about the future. She would proceed with her systematic withdrawal, but she wouldn't proceed alone. Sometimes the most important lessons required witnesses to ensure they were learned correctly. She reached for her phone to make the first call. Vanessa? It's Eleanor. I need to cancel babysitting tomorrow evening. I'm going to be occupied with some family archival work for the foreseeable future. You'll need to make other arrangements. The conversation was brief, professional, and left no room for negotiation. When Eleanor hung up, she found Marcus studying a water-damaged photograph of Robert and David building a treehouse. Worth saving? She asked. Definitely, he said. Some things are too important to let go, even when they require extra effort to preserve. Eleanor smiled, her first genuine smile since discovering those garbage bags. My thoughts exactly. The first ripple had been set in motion. By evening, Vanessa would discover what happened when the support structure she'd taken for granted suddenly required conscious attention. And Eleanor would be watching to see how quickly they realized that the space they'd wanted came with consequences they hadn't considered. Some lessons, she reflected as she returned to her restoration work, were best learned through experience rather than explanation. Some lessons, she reflected as she returned to her restoration work, were best learned through experience rather than explanation. By Tuesday afternoon, Eleanor's systematic approach was already yielding results. She'd spent the morning at David's house while they were at work and school, using her spare key one final time. The key now sat on her kitchen counter, a small, piece of metal that had once represented trust and family integration, now transformed into evidence of boundaries being redrawn. She'd been methodical about the removal. Her emergency supplies from their hall closet, the flashlight she'd provided after their power outage last winter, the first aid kit she'd stocked with children's medicine, the spare phone charger that had saved David from missed calls during client emergencies, the refrigerator magnets with her contact information, the spare reading glasses she kept in their kitchen drawer. Small things, practical things, things that had become invisible through routine until their absence would make them suddenly, glaringly visible. Eleanor was arranging restored photographs in acid-free storage boxes when her phone rang at 4:47 p.m. Eleanor? Vanessa's voice carried a strain that hadn't been there during their brief conversation the previous evening. I'm so sorry to bother you, but I have a huge problem. The babysitter I arranged for tonight just canceled. Her daughter's sick, and I have this crucial presentation with the Morrison Group at 7. It's been on the calendar for months. Eleanor continued placing photographs in chronological order, her movements precise and unhurried. I'm sorry to hear about your scheduling conflict. Is there any way? I know you said you were busy with archival work, but this meeting could literally make or break my quarter. Could you possibly watch Lily? Just for a few hours? The desperation in Vanessa's voice was new. Eleanor had heard her daughter-in-law handle client crises, navigate workplace politics, manage household emergencies with cool efficiency. This was different. This was panic. I'm afraid that won't be possible, Eleanor said gently. I'm quite committed to my current project, and it requires my full attention this evening. Silence stretched across the connection. Eleanor could almost hear Vanessa recalculating, searching for alternatives that had always existed in the form of Eleanor's availability. What about, could David leave work early? I know he has that database migration scheduled, but that sounds like something you'll need to work out between yourselves, Eleanor replied. I'm sure you'll find a solution. After hanging up, Eleanor returned to her photographs. A picture of 3-year-old David covered in birthday cake frosting, Robert laughing in the background. Another of David's first day of kindergarten, his small hand clutching Robert's finger as they walked toward the school building. Images of a family system where support flowed naturally, where presence was assumed rather than calculated. Her phone buzzed with a text from David at 6:15 p.m. Mom, can you call me? We need help with Lily tonight. Eleanor read the message twice, then set her phone aside. Natural consequences, Marcus had said. The most effective lessons emerged from experiencing the results of one's choices rather than having those results explained or mitigated by others. At 7:30, David called directly. Mom, thank God you answered. Vanessa had to miss her big presentation tonight because we couldn't find anyone to watch Lily. She's pretty upset. I don't suppose you could help us out Thursday morning? I have that early meeting with the Seattle team, and after tonight. Eleanor could hear the television in the background, Lily's voice asking someone, probably David, why Mommy was crying. I won't be available Thursday morning either, sweetheart. Or Saturday evening, for that matter. My archival project is quite extensive. Archival project? David's confusion was genuine. Mom, what exactly are you working on? Organizing and cataloging family photographs, Eleanor said. Determining which memories are worth preserving and which should be discarded. It's proving to be quite time-consuming. The silence that followed told her David was processing the implications of her word choice. Discarded. The same term Vanessa had used so casually on Sunday. Look, about Sunday night. Maybe we were too hasty with some of those old photos. If you want to bring some of them back to the house. That won't be necessary, Eleanor interrupted smoothly. Vanessa was quite clear about needing space. I'm simply ensuring she has it. Wednesday brought a call from the dance studio where Lily took classes. Eleanor's credit card, which had automatically charged for monthly tuition, had been declined. She'd canceled it Tuesday morning and opened a new account, a small administrative task that would require David and Vanessa to handle their daughter's activities through their own financial planning. Thursday morning arrived without the usual text from David asking her to pick up Lily from school if his meeting ran late. Instead, Eleanor's phone remained blissfully quiet as she worked on restoration techniques for water-damaged photographs, guided by YouTube tutorials and half-remembered conservation methods from her library days. It was Lily who finally broke the pattern. Friday afternoon, as Eleanor sorted through photographs of family Christmas mornings, someone knocked on her door with the persistence of a 6-year-old who had something important to say. Eleanor opened it to find Lily standing on her porch, school backpack still on her shoulders, her face serious in the way children look when adult behavior has confused them beyond their ability to rationalize. "Grandma Eleanor, why won't you come to our house anymore?" Eleanor's carefully maintained composure wavered. She knelt to Lily's eye level, noting the way her granddaughter's dark hair had escaped its morning ponytails, the grass stain on her school uniform that suggested recess adventures. "I've been very busy this week, sweetheart, working on something important." "Mommy said you're mad about the pictures." Lily's directness was devastating. "She said you'll get over it soon, and things will go back to normal." Eleanor felt something cold settle in her chest. Get over it. As if 40 years of marriage, of family history, of careful curation of memories was simply a mood to be weathered rather than a loss to be grieved. "What do you think about the pictures being gone?" Eleanor asked gently. Lily's face crumpled slightly. "I miss them. I liked the stories you told about Daddy when he was little, and about Grandpa Robert, and about when you were young like me. Now there's no pictures to help me remember the stories." Eleanor pulled her granddaughter into a hug, breathing in the familiar scent of strawberry shampoo and playground dust. "The stories are still here," she whispered, tapping Lily's chest, gently. "Pictures help us remember, but the stories live in our hearts." "Will you tell me stories again, even without the pictures?" "Someday," Eleanor promised, "when things are different." Lily pulled back to study her grandmother's face with the intense scrutiny children reserved for adults whose behavior had become unpredictable. "Are you sad, Grandma Eleanor?" Eleanor considered the question carefully. Was she sad? Or was she something else entirely? Something that had moved beyond sadness into a territory that required different words, different responses. "I'm learning something important," she said finally, "about what happens when people think some things don't matter. And sometimes learning takes time." After Lily left, walking home with the careful steps of a child carrying information she didn't quite understand, Eleanor returned to her restoration work. But her granddaughter's visit had shifted something in her approach. This wasn't just about teaching David and Vanessa the practical value of her contributions. It was about Lily understanding that some things, some people, were worth fighting for, even when that fight looked like withdrawal rather than confrontation. That evening, David called again. "Mom, we need to talk. Really talk. Vanessa missed another meeting today because our backup childcare fell through, and Lily's dance teacher called about payment, and I can't find the spare key you usually keep." His voice trailed off as the full scope of the problem became clear. "It sounds like you have quite a few things to figure out," Eleanor said gently. "I'm sure you and Vanessa will find solutions that work for your family's needs. But Mom, you are part of our family." Eleanor set down the photograph she'd been examining. Robert teaching David to tie his shoes, both of them focused intently on the task, both of them patient with the learning process. "Yes," she said quietly, "I am. The question is whether that membership comes with value or just obligation, whether I'm family or just clutter." The silence that followed told her David was finally beginning to understand the lesson she'd been teaching all week. Some things were worth keeping. Some relationships required active choice rather than passive assumption. And some spaces, once created, were much harder to fill than anyone anticipated. And some spaces, once created, were much harder to fill than anyone anticipated. By the following Tuesday, Eleanor's systematic withdrawal had created what business analysts might call a cascade failure. She watched the developments with the detached interest of a researcher observing an experiment unfold according to hypothesis. The first domino had been Lily's soccer registration. Eleanor had quietly paid the league fees for 3 seasons, a $200 expense that David and Vanessa had somehow never questioned or perhaps simply forgotten originated from Eleanor's account. When the automatic payment failed and Lily was removed from the roster 2 days before the season started, the tears that followed could be heard through the duplex walls. The second was their mortgage payment. Eleanor had been supplementing their monthly housing costs by $400 for the past 18 months, assistance that had begun during David's job transition and had simply continued because asking for it to stop would have required acknowledging they'd needed it in the first place. The bank's automated call about a late payment arrived on David's phone while he was already dealing with the childcare crisis that had become his new normal. Eleanor was digitizing photographs. She'd invested in a proper scanner, finding therapeutic value in the precise work of restoration, when her phone rang at 11:23 a.m. on Wednesday. "Eleanor, it's Rebecca." David's sister's voice carried the professional calm of someone accustomed to family crises, but underneath, Eleanor could detect something sharper. Rebecca lived in Oregon, managed her own therapy practice, and typically served as the family's emotional Switzerland during conflicts. Her involvement meant David had escalated beyond his usual conflict avoidance strategies. "Rebecca, how lovely to hear from you. David called me last night. He's pretty panicked. He says you've stopped babysitting in there. Have been some financial complications, and something about family photographs being thrown away." Rebecca's therapist training made her voice carefully neutral, but Eleanor caught the undercurrent of protective anger. "I'm trying to understand what's happening." Eleanor set down her scanner and considered her response. Rebecca had always been perceptive, had inherited Robert's ability to see through surface explanations to underlying dynamics. There would be no point in deflecting. "Your brother's wife decided our family photographs were clutter," Eleanor said, simply. 40 years of family history, including your baby pictures and your father's military service photos, got put out with the garbage Sunday night. Vanessa said they needed space. The silence stretched long enough for Eleanor to hear Rebecca's intake of breath, the soft sound of professional composure cracking against personal shock. "All of them? Even Dad's pictures?" "Everything. I managed to salvage some from the garbage bags, but much of it was water damaged." Eleanor's voice remained steady. "I've been spending my time trying to restore what's recoverable and organizing what isn't." "And the babysitting? The financial issues David mentioned?" "I've withdrawn my regular support while I focus on this archival project. It seemed appropriate, given their need for space." Eleanor allowed a slight pause. "I hadn't realized they were so dependent on assistance they'd characterized as non-essential." Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, and Eleanor could almost hear her sister-in-law's analytical mind working through the implications. "Eleanor, I need to ask this directly. Is this strategic?" The question was exactly what Eleanor had expected from Rebecca. Direct, professional, cutting through emotional complexity to examine behavioral patterns. "It's proportional," Eleanor said carefully. "If family history and my presence are clutter to be discarded, then presumably all my presence, including financial support and childcare assistance, falls into the same category. This is going to get worse before it gets better." "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "It probably is." That afternoon brought the arrival Eleanor hadn't anticipated. She was working on a particularly damaged photograph of Rebecca's high school graduation when a car door slammed in her driveway with more force than David's usual gentle approach. Through her front window, she saw a woman in her early 60s stepping out of a silver sedan with the purposeful stride of someone who had driven a considerable distance to have a difficult conversation. Sarah Chen, Vanessa's mother. Eleanor had met Sarah perhaps a dozen times over the 3 years since David and Vanessa's wedding. A small, precise woman who had built a successful accounting practice after immigrating from Taiwan 30 years ago. Polite but distant, protective of her daughter in the way of parents who had sacrificed considerably to provide opportunities their children sometimes took for granted. The knock on her door was firm, businesslike. Mrs. Matthews. Sarah's voice carried no preamble, no social niceties. "We need to talk." Eleanor invited her in, noting how Sarah's eyes swept across the living room transformed into an archival workspace. Photographs in various stages of restoration covered every surface. The scanner hummed quietly on the dining table. Storage boxes lined the walls with the methodical organization of someone who understood the value of systematic preservation. "Vanessa called me yesterday," Sarah said without sitting down. "Very upset. She says you are punishing the family because of some old photographs." Eleanor gestured toward a chair, but Sarah remained standing, her posture suggesting this would be a brief conversation with a predetermined outcome. "These aren't some old photographs," Eleanor said quietly. "These are 40 years of family history, pictures of my late husband, of David's childhood, of family events and celebrations, irreplaceable memories that got put out with the garbage." Sarah's expression shifted slightly as she took in the scope of the restoration project. Eleanor watched recognition dawn as Sarah understood this wasn't about sentiment or attachment to objects, but about the systematic destruction of family legacy. "Show me," Sarah said. For the next 20 minutes, Eleanor walked Sarah through the damaged albums, wedding photographs with water stains obscuring faces, baby pictures torn from careless handling, Robert's military service photos, some completely destroyed, others barely salvageable, family Christmas mornings, birthday celebrations, quiet moments of everyday life that had seemed ordinary when they were lived, but had become precious in retrospect. Sarah's expression grew increasingly grim as she examined the extent of the damage. "Vanessa did not tell me it was everything," she said finally. She said, "Some old pictures that were taking up storage space." "There were 12 albums and several boxes of loose photographs," Eleanor said, "spanning 4 decades, much of it irreplaceable." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying a water-damaged photograph of Robert teaching David to ride a bicycle. When she looked up, her expression held something Eleanor hadn't seen before: understanding. "In my culture, we have a saying, when you throw away the past, you throw away the future. Children need to know where they come from to understand where they are going." Eleanor nodded. Lily loved looking through these albums. She knew all the stories, could identify relatives, understood her place in the family history. "And now?" "Now she asks me why her pictures are gone and why I don't come to visit anymore." Sarah's mouth tightened. Vanessa grew up in difficult circumstances. Her father had problems with keeping things, keeping too many things. The house was. She gestured vaguely, searching for words. Chaos. Mountains of newspapers, broken furniture, things that should have been thrown away years ago. She has strong reactions to clutter because of this. Eleanor felt a piece of the puzzle click into place. "I didn't know." She does not like to talk about it. But this. Sarah waved toward the restoration project. "This is not the same thing. This is family. This is memory. This is important." The sound of a car door slamming interrupted them. Through the window, Eleanor saw David's sedan in the driveway, and a moment later, Vanessa emerging from the passenger side with the rigid posture of someone who had been crying recently. "I called them," Sarah said simply. "Told them to come here. This conversation needs to happen with everyone present. Eleanor braced herself as footsteps approached her front door. David knocked softly, still avoiding confrontation even in crisis, while Vanessa's silhouette in the window suggested she was steeling herself for battle. When Eleanor opened the door, she was struck by how different they both looked. David's face showed the strain of a week spent managing responsibilities he'd never fully understood. Vanessa's usual polished composure had cracked, revealing something raw and defensive underneath. "Mom," David started, but Vanessa cut him off. "Eleanor, this has gone far enough. I understand you're upset about the photographs, but punishing Lily by refusing to see her isn't fair to anyone." Sarah spoke before Eleanor could respond. "Vanessa, stop talking and start listening." The authority in Sarah's voice made both David and Vanessa freeze. Eleanor realized she was about to witness a conversation that had been 30 years in the making, between a mother who had sacrificed everything to build a new life and a daughter who had perhaps never fully understood the cost of forgetting where you came from. The space in Eleanor's living room suddenly felt very small, crowded with damaged photographs and difficult truths that could no longer be avoided. The space in Eleanor's living room suddenly felt very small, crowded with damaged photographs and difficult truths that could no longer be avoided. Sarah moved to the center of the room with the purposeful grace of someone accustomed to commanding attention in boardrooms and family crises alike. Her eyes swept across the restoration project before settling on her daughter with an expression Eleanor recognized, the look of a parent preparing to deliver a lesson that should have been learned years ago. "Vanessa, sit down," Sarah commanded, in Mandarin, then switched to English. "Eleanor, David, you too. This conversation has been delayed too long." Eleanor watched Vanessa's face cycle through emotions, surprise at her mother's unexpected authority, embarrassment at being addressed like a child in front of her in-laws, and something deeper that looked like old fear. David perched on the edge of Eleanor's couch, as if ready to flee at the first sign of escalating conflict. Sarah picked up a water-damaged photograph from the coffee table. Robert and Eleanor's wedding portrait, his young face blurred but still recognizable in his military dress uniform. "When I came to America in 1985, Sarah began, her voice carrying the measured cadence of someone who had told this story before but never in quite these circumstances. I could bring only 2 suitcases. Everything else, family photographs, my grandmother's jewelry, letters from my parents, books I had loved, all of it stayed behind. You know what I regretted most?" She looked directly at Vanessa, who had gone very still. "The photographs. Because without pictures, memories fade. Children grow up not knowing their grandfather's face, not understanding where their mother's determination came from, not seeing the continuity that connects one generation to the next." Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, recognition of a pain she'd never considered. Her own loss was devastating, but it was loss after preservation. Sarah had been forced to choose what pieces of her past could survive the journey to a new life. "I spent 15 years taking pictures of everything," Sarah continued. "Every birthday, every holiday, every small moment that seemed ordinary. Because I knew how quickly the ordinary becomes precious when it's gone." Vanessa's composed mask was beginning to crack. "Mom, that's different. That was survival. That was understanding that family history is not clutter," Sarah interrupted sharply. "That knowing where you come from helps you know where you are going. That children need stories to understand who they are." David cleared his throat tentatively. But Vanessa grew up with difficult circumstances too. Her father's hoarding problem was about keeping broken things, Sarah said firmly. About inability to let go of what was truly worthless. This, she gestured toward Eleanor's restoration project, is the opposite. This is preserving what has meaning. Vanessa's control finally shattered. "You don't understand what it was like." Her voice rose with years of suppressed frustration. living in that house where you couldn't walk through the hallways, where every surface was covered with newspapers and broken appliances and garbage Dad refused to throw away, where I was embarrassed to bring friends home because there wasn't room for people among all the things. Tears were streaming down her face now, and Eleanor saw David move instinctively toward his wife, then stop, uncertain how to comfort pain. He'd never fully understood. So when I finally had my own space, Vanessa continued, I swore I would never let things accumulate like that. I would keep only what was necessary, only what was functional. I would have room to breathe. Sarah's expression softened slightly, but her voice remained firm. And in your fear of becoming your father, you threw away Eleanor's heart. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Eleanor felt her own emotional armor crack as she saw Vanessa's pain clearly for the first time, not selfishness or disregard, but terror. The desperate need for control born from childhood chaos. I didn't mean to hurt you, Vanessa whispered, looking at Eleanor with raw vulnerability. I can't live surrounded by things that feel like they're closing in on me. Even beautiful things. Even important things. Eleanor found herself thinking of Marcus's words about natural consequences, about the difference between punishment and instruction. Had her withdrawal been teaching the right lesson, or had it simply added more pain to an already wounded family system? The photographs weren't just things, Eleanor said gently. They were Lily's connection to her grandfather she'll never meet. They were David's childhood, your wedding day, family celebrations that happened once and can't be recreated. I know that now, Vanessa said through her tears, but I didn't know how to separate meaningful from overwhelming. Everything felt like too much. Sarah moved to sit beside her daughter, speaking softly in Mandarin. Eleanor caught fragments, words. That sounded like comfort, like understanding. Like a mother acknowledging her daughter's pain while still maintaining that pain didn't excuse causing pain to others. David finally spoke, his voice strained. Mom, I should have protected those pictures. I should have stood up for you when it mattered. I thought if I stayed out of it, everyone would figure it out on their own. Eleanor looked at her son, really looked at him, and saw Robert's gentleness, but also his father's occasional failure to act when action was required. Conflict avoidance isn't neutrality, David. Sometimes it's choosing the wrong side by refusing to choose at all. The conversation was interrupted by Eleanor's phone buzzing with a text message. She glanced at it and felt her heart constrict. Rebecca, flying in tomorrow morning. This family meeting is happening whether everyone's ready or not. Eleanor showed the message to Sarah, who nodded approvingly. Good. Sometimes healing requires outside perspective. As the immediate crisis of confrontation began to settle, Eleanor found herself emotionally drained in a way she hadn't experienced since the weeks following Robert's death. The anger that had sustained her systematic withdrawal was giving way to something more complex, understanding mixed with hurt, recognition of shared pain complicated by the need for accountability. After David and Vanessa left, with promises to talk more, to think more, to try to find solutions that honored both Eleanor's need for memory preservation and Vanessa's need for manageable space, Eleanor sat alone among her restoration project and wondered if she'd been fighting the right battle with the right weapons. Her phone rang as darkness settled over the neighborhood. Eleanor? It's Marcus. I saw the cars in your driveway earlier. Rough day? Something in his voice, gentle concern without intrusion, made Eleanor's careful composure finally crumble. I think I may have made things worse instead of better. Want some company? I have a bottle of wine and a good listening ear. 20 minutes later, Marcus sat in Eleanor's kitchen while she made tea. The restoration project spread around them like evidence of a life in transition. She found herself telling him about the confrontation, about Vanessa's childhood trauma, about her own growing uncertainty about whether her approach was helping or harming the people she loved. The hardest part of grief counseling, Marcus said thoughtfully, is helping people distinguish between consequences that teach and consequences that punish. Both involve pain, but only one leads to growth. Eleanor set down her teacup, looking at this man who had somehow become her confidant during the most challenging weeks she'd experienced since Robert's death. How do you tell the difference? Consequences that teach preserve relationship while changing behavior. Consequences that punish destroy relationship to change behavior. Marcus paused, studying her face. Which do you think you've been doing? Eleanor considered this as she watched Marcus's hands wrapped around his teacup, gentle hands that had comforted grieving families, that had helped her sort through damaged photographs, that had offered support without judgment during her own crisis. I wanted them to understand what they'd lost, she said slowly, but I think I may have lost sight of what I was trying to preserve. Marcus reached across the table and covered her hand with his. The gesture was simple, natural, but it sent warmth through Eleanor that had nothing to do with the tea, and everything to do with the realization that grief and anger had made room for something else. Connection, possibility, the chance for new beginnings even in the midst of family crisis. It's not too late to change course, he said softly. Families are remarkably resilient when love is the foundation, even when the structure needs rebuilding. Eleanor turned her hand palm up, intertwining her fingers with his. For the first time in weeks, she felt something besides anger and determination. She felt hope. The next morning brought an envelope slipped under her door. Her name was written in careful 6-year-old handwriting, with a drawing of stick figures holding hands decorating the corner. Inside, in Lily's best printing, was a letter that made Eleanor's heart break and heal simultaneously. Dear Grandma Eleanor, I miss you and I miss our picture stories. Mommy says you are sad about the pictures being gone, and I am sad too. Will, you come back and tell me stories even without pictures. I drew you a new picture of our family. You are the tall one with the big smile. Love, Lily Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by restored photographs and the evidence of her systematic withdrawal, holding a child's drawing that showed more wisdom about family than all her strategic planning had managed to achieve. Perhaps it was time to consider that the space she'd created could be filled with something better than absence. Perhaps it was time to consider that the space she'd created could be filled with something better than absence. Eleanor held Lily's drawing for a long moment, studying the stick figure family where she appeared as the tall one with the big smile. The child had drawn them all holding hands, Eleanor, David, Vanessa, and Lily herself, standing in front of a house with an oversized door and windows that looked like eyes. It was the kind of drawing that went on refrigerators, the kind that got saved in memory boxes, the kind that became precious precisely because it captured a moment of innocent hope, the kind that might end up in a garbage bag if Eleanor didn't find a way to bridge the space that had grown between them. But even as the thought formed, Eleanor felt her resolve crystallize around a different realization. Thursday was Lily's school play, The 3 Little Pigs, where Lily had been cast as the narrator, a role she'd been practicing for weeks. Eleanor had attended every school performance since Lily started kindergarten. Her presence in the third row, center seat, had become as predictable as the seasons. This year, that seat would remain empty. Eleanor folded Lily's letter carefully and placed it in the box with the other restored photographs. Natural consequences, she reminded herself. If she was truly teaching this lesson, she couldn't selectively apply it based on her own emotional comfort. The empty seat would speak louder than any words about what happened when family became disposable. Thursday evening arrived with the sharp clarity that comes before difficult decisions. Eleanor sat in her living room, surrounded by her restoration project, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood settling into evening routines. She could have been at Roosevelt Elementary, watching her granddaughter's debut performance, taking pictures with the small digital camera she'd bought specifically for capturing Lily's milestones. Instead, she was learning what space felt like. when it replaced presence. At 7:15 p.m., her phone buzzed with a text from David. "Mom, saving your seat. Play starts in 15 minutes." Eleanor read the message twice, then set her phone aside without responding. The hardest lessons she'd learned during her library career were the ones that required following through even when your heart was breaking. By 8:30, she knew the play was over. Lily would be looking for her in the small crowd of parents and grandparents, scanning faces for the familiar smile that had been her constant for 6 years. She would be disappointed, confused, maybe even hurt in ways that would linger long after the immediate crisis passed. Eleanor was arranging Restored photographs in chronological order when the dizziness hit. It started as a vague lightheadedness, the kind that sometimes accompanied standing too quickly, but intensified into something that made her grip the edge of the dining table for support. Her chest felt tight, her breathing shallow, and for a moment the room seemed to tilt in ways that defied physics. She managed to reach her phone and dial Marcus's number before the floor seemed to rise up to meet her. "Eleanor? Eleanor, are you there?" Marcus's voice sounded distant, filtered through the strange hollow sensation that had settled over her consciousness. She tried to respond but found her voice had disappeared somewhere between intention and execution. "I'm coming over," Marcus said, and Eleanor heard him moving, heard keys jingling, heard the urgency that meant he understood this wasn't a social call. The next few minutes passed in fragments. Marcus's voice at her door, then his face appearing above her as she lay on her living room floor surrounded by scattered photographs. His hands checking her pulse, his voice calm but concerned as he called 911. The arrival of paramedics who took her blood pressure and asked questions about stress levels and recent life changes. "Panic attack," the lead paramedic explained to Marcus as Eleanor's breathing gradually returned to normal. "Probably brought on by sustained stress. Blood pressure's elevated but not dangerous. Heart rate's settling down now." Eleanor found her voice as they helped her to the couch. "I'm fine, just overwhelmed for a moment." "Ma'am," the paramedic said gently, "panic attacks are your body's way of saying something needs to change. Have you been under unusual stress lately?" Eleanor looked around her living room. Photographs everywhere. Evidence of her systematic withdrawal from family life. The careful architecture of consequences she'd built over the past 2 weeks. "You could say that." After the paramedics left, Marcus sat beside her on the couch, his presence steady and reassuring in a way that made Eleanor realize how isolated she'd become in her pursuit of teaching lessons about isolation. "Want to tell me what triggered this?" he asked softly. "Lily's school play was tonight." The words came out smaller than Eleanor intended. "I didn't go." Marcus was quiet for a moment, and Eleanor could feel him processing the implications. "First time you've missed one?" "First time I've missed anything that mattered to her." Eleanor leaned back against the couch cushions, feeling exhausted in ways that went beyond physical fatigue. "I wanted them to understand what absence feels like. I think I'm learning instead." Marcus's phone buzzed with an incoming call. He glanced at the display and showed it to Eleanor. Rebecca's name appeared on the screen. "I should take this," Marcus said apologetically. "I called her when you were unconscious. I was worried." Eleanor nodded, listening to one side of a conversation that clearly involved her health, her emotional state, and growing concern from family members who were beginning to understand that consequences could spiral beyond anyone's control. "She's stable now," Marcus was saying. "But Rebecca, I think this family situation has escalated beyond what Eleanor can handle alone. She's been carrying this burden for 2 weeks without any real support system, and tonight." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Eleanor couldn't hear Rebecca's response, but Marcus's expression grew increasingly serious as the conversation continued. "Tomorrow morning? Are you sure you can get a flight that quickly? A pause. Yes, I think that's probably necessary. This isn't just about family conflict anymore. Eleanor's health is at stake. After Marcus hung up, Eleanor felt something that had been building for days finally break open inside her chest. I think I've made a terrible mistake. What kind of mistake? I wanted to teach them about consequences, about taking family for granted, but I think I've just hurt the one person I was trying to protect. Eleanor's voice broke slightly. Lily doesn't understand why her grandmother suddenly stopped caring about her. All she knows is that I wasn't there when she needed me to be. Marcus moved closer, his arm settling around Eleanor's shoulders with gentle authority. Teaching moments and punishment aren't the same thing. One builds understanding, the other just builds walls. Robert would have known the difference, Eleanor said quietly. He had this way of setting boundaries that maintained connection. I've only known how to withdraw completely. Robert isn't here to fix this, Marcus said gently. But you are. And it's not too late to change course. Eleanor's phone rang before she could respond. David's name appeared on the display, and Eleanor's stomach clenched with the certainty that this call would not be about scheduling or routine family logistics. Mom? David's voice carried strain that went beyond the usual conflict avoidance discomfort. We need to talk, tonight. Can I come over? David, it's late, and I've had… Lily cried for an hour after the play, David interrupted, his voice carrying an edge Eleanor hadn't heard since he was a teenager pushing back against parental authority. She kept asking why Grandma Eleanor didn't come, why you don't love her anymore, why our family is broken. Eleanor felt the words hit like physical blows. David, I never said I didn't love. You didn't have to say it, Mom. Your empty seat said it for you. David's voice cracked slightly. And Vanessa, after seeing Lily so upset, after realizing how much damage we've all done to each other. She's been throwing up all evening. Stress reaction, maybe guilt, I don't know. But this has to stop. Eleanor looked at Marcus, who was listening to her side of the conversation with growing concern. David, I think we all need to… No, Mom. No more thinking, no more strategizing, no more lessons about consequences. My daughter is heartbroken. My wife is sick with guilt. And according to Rebecca's phone call 20 minutes ago, you collapsed and had to call the paramedics. This ends now. The authority in David's voice was something Eleanor had never heard before. Not the conflict-avoidant son who spent his life trying to keep everyone happy, but a father and husband who had finally recognized that leadership meant making hard choices rather than avoiding them. I'm coming over, David continued, and I'm bringing Vanessa and Lily. We're going to sit in your living room surrounded by all those photographs you've been working so hard to restore, and we're going to figure out how to be a family again. Because whatever lessons we needed to learn, we've learned them. And the cost of this education is destroying the very thing we're supposed to be protecting. Eleanor felt tears she'd been holding back for 2 weeks finally break free. David. I love you, Mom. We all love you. But love without presence is just an idea. And ideas don't help 6-year-olds understand why their grandmother suddenly disappears from their life. I should have protected those photographs. I should have stood up for you. And I should have stopped this spiral before it hurt Lily. I'm fixing all of that tonight. After David hung up, Eleanor sat in the silence that followed, feeling the weight of decisions that had seemed so clear 2 weeks ago but now felt complicated by consequences she hadn't fully considered. They're coming over, she told Marcus. Good, he said simply. Some conversations can't wait for convenient timing. Eleanor looked around her living room one more time, at the photographs that had started this crisis, at the evidence of her systematic withdrawal, at the space she'd created that had indeed taught lessons about absence, but perhaps not the ones she'd intended. I don't know how to fix this, she admitted. Marcus squeezed her hand gently. Start by admitting that the lesson you were teaching became more important than the relationships you were trying to preserve. The rest will follow. Through her front window, Eleanor could see headlights turning into her driveway. David's car, carrying the family she'd been trying to educate about loss by giving them direct experience with it. In a few minutes, they would all be sitting together surrounded by the photographs that had started this crisis, trying to figure out how to build bridges across the space that had grown between them. Eleanor took a deep breath and prepared to discover whether the emptiness she'd created could be filled with something more substantial than the lessons she'd been trying to teach. Some spaces, she was learning, were harder to close than they were to create. Some spaces, she was learning, were harder to close than they were to create. Eleanor stood at her front door 15 minutes later, watching her fragmented family emerge from David's car into the pool of light cast by her porch lamp. Lily came first, clutching a stuffed pig, clearly a memento from the school play Eleanor had missed. The child's face showed the peculiar combination of hope and wariness that children develop when adult behavior becomes unpredictable. Vanessa moved slowly, her usual polished composure replaced by something raw and uncertain. Even in the dim light, Eleanor could see the strain of the past 2 weeks written in the tight line of her shoulders, the careful way she held herself, as if sudden movements might shatter whatever fragile control she'd managed to maintain. David emerged last, his posture carrying an authority Eleanor hadn't seen since he was a teenager, defending a friend from playground bullies. This was her son, but not the conflict-avoidant man who had let this crisis spiral beyond anyone's control. Something fundamental had shifted in the hours since Lily's play. "Grandma Eleanor?" Lily's voice was small but hopeful. "Daddy said we could come see your pictures. The ones you've been fixing." Eleanor knelt to Lily's eye level, her earlier panic attack making the movement more difficult than usual. "Yes, sweetheart. I've been working very hard to fix the pictures. That got hurt. Can you tell me stories again, even if some pictures are broken?" The simple question cut through weeks of strategic thinking and emotional complexity to reach something essential. A 6-year-old who needed connection to her family history more than she needed the adults in her life to resolve their conflicts. Perfectly. "Yes," Eleanor said, surprised by the certainty in her voice. "Stories don't disappear when pictures get damaged. They just need different ways of being told." As they settled into Eleanor's living room, the full scope of her restoration project became visible to her family for the first time. Every surface held photographs in various stages of recovery. Some had been successfully restored, looking almost as crisp as they had decades ago. Others showed the careful work of conservation, water stains that couldn't be removed but had been stabilized, tears that had been mended with archival tape, images that would never be perfect but had been preserved as completely as possible. The dining table held Eleanor's most ambitious project, a large album she'd been rebuilding page by page, reorganizing family chronology from the scattered fragments she'd salvaged. Wedding photos, baby pictures, holiday celebrations, quiet moments of ordinary life that had become precious in retrospect. Vanessa moved toward the table slowly, her expression shifting as she understood the magnitude of what Eleanor had been attempting. "You've been doing all this? For 2 weeks?" "Longer," Eleanor said quietly. Some of these photographs needed extensive restoration work. The water damage was significant. Vanessa picked up a wedding photo that Eleanor had spent hours carefully drying and flattening. The image showed Eleanor and Robert cutting their cake, both of them laughing at something just outside the frame. Despite the water stains that had created a sepia effect around the edges, their joy was unmistakable. "I remember this from your wedding album," Vanessa said softly. "David showed it to me when we were first dating. He said his parents had the kind of marriage he hoped to have someday." Eleanor felt Marcus's presence behind her. He'd remained during the family arrival, perhaps sensing that this conversation would need witnesses who weren't caught in the emotional crossfire. His hand touched her shoulder briefly, offering support without intrusion. "That album was in the garage bags," Eleanor said simply. "Most of it was too damaged to save." The silence that followed was broken by David clearing his throat. "Mom, before we go any further, I need to say something. All of us need to understand exactly what happened here and why." Eleanor watched her son position himself at the center of the room, his usual tendency to hover at the edges of difficult conversations replaced by something that looked like leadership. "2 weeks ago, my wife threw away 40 years of family photographs without consulting anyone," David said, his voice steady but carrying weight that made everyone in the room go still. "My response was to try to smooth things over without addressing the fundamental problem. Mom's response was to withdraw completely from our family system to teach us a lesson about consequences." He looked at each person in turn, Eleanor, Vanessa, even Lily, who was listening with the intense focus children bring to adult conversations they sense are important. "All of us made choices that hurt other people. All of us prioritized our own needs over family connection. And the person who paid the highest price was Lily, who lost her connection to family stories, lost her regular time with her grandmother, and spent tonight crying because she thinks the adults in her life have stopped loving each other." Lily's lower lip trembled at David's words, and Eleanor felt her heart constrict at the visible evidence of how their adult conflict had wounded the very person they were all trying to protect. "But tonight ends the blame and starts the solutions," David continued. "Because I'm not letting my daughter grow up thinking that love is conditional on perfect behavior, or that family connections can be discarded when they become inconvenient." Eleanor studied her son's face, seeing Robert's determination combined with something uniquely David's, a gentleness that refused to sacrifice people for principles. "Eleanor," David said, turning to face her directly, "I need you to tell us exactly how you've been feeling since Sunday night. Not the strategic version, not the lesson-teaching version. The truth about what it did to you to see those photographs in garbage bags." Eleanor felt the careful emotional control she'd maintained for 2 weeks begin to crack under her son's direct attention. Around her, the restoration project that had consumed her days and nights stood as evidence of grief, transformed into methodical action. "It felt like being erased," she said quietly. 40 years of marriage to your father, 36 years of being your mother, 6 years of being Lily's grandmother. All of it reduced to clutter that was taking up too much space." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "But it wasn't just about the photographs themselves. It was about the assumption that my attachment to family history was excessive, that the stories I've been keeping for all of you were somehow neurotic rather than necessary." Eleanor looked at Vanessa, who was holding the wedding photograph with hands that shook slightly. "I've been your family's historian for decades. I remember which Christmas Lily first walked, which birthday David lost his first tooth. What your father looked like holding his grandson for the first time. When those photographs got thrown away, it felt like someone had decided that my role in this family was disposable too." Vanessa set down the photograph carefully, as if it might shatter under too much pressure. "Eleanor, I never—" The authority in David's voice was something Eleanor had never heard before. Not the conflict-avoidant son who spent his life trying to keep everyone happy, but a father and husband who had finally recognized that leadership meant making hard choices rather than avoiding them. "I'm coming over," David continued, "and I'm bringing Vanessa and Lily. We're going to sit in your living room surrounded by all those photographs you've been working so hard to restore, and we're going to figure out how to be a family again. Because whatever lessons we needed to learn, we've learned them. And the cost of this education is destroying the very thing we're supposed to be protecting." Eleanor felt tears she'd been holding back for 2 weeks finally break free. "David, I love you, Mom. We all love you. But love without presence is just an idea. And ideas don't help 6-year-olds understand why their grandmother suddenly disappears from their life. I should have protected those photographs. I should have stood up for you. And I should have stopped this spiral before it hurt Lily. I'm fixing all of that tonight." After David hung up, Eleanor sat in the silence that followed, feeling the weight of decisions that had seemed so clear 2 weeks ago but now felt complicated by consequences she hadn't fully considered. "They're coming over," she told Marcus. "Good," he said simply. "Some conversations can't wait for convenient timing." Eleanor looked around her living room one more time, at the photographs that had started this crisis, at the evidence of her systematic withdrawal, at the space she'd created that had indeed taught lessons about absence, but perhaps not the ones she'd intended. "I don't know how to fix this," she admitted. Marcus squeezed her hand gently. "Start by admitting that the lesson you were teaching became more important than the relationships you were trying to preserve. The rest will follow." Through her front window, Eleanor could see headlights turning into her driveway. David's car, carrying the family she'd been trying to educate about loss by giving them direct experience with it. In a few minutes, they would all be sitting together surrounded by the photographs that had started this crisis, trying to figure out how to build bridges across the space that had grown between them. Eleanor took a deep breath and prepared to discover whether the emptiness she'd created could be filled with something more substantial than the lessons she'd been trying to teach. Some spaces, she was learning, were harder to close than they were to create. Some spaces, she was learning, were harder to close than they were to create. Eleanor stood at her front door 15 minutes later, watching her fragmented family emerge from David's car into the pool of light cast by her porch lamp. Lily came first, clutching a stuffed pig, clearly a memento from the school play Eleanor had missed. The child's face showed the peculiar combination of hope and wariness that children develop when adult behavior becomes unpredictable. Vanessa moved slowly, her usual polished composure replaced by something raw and uncertain. Even in the dim light, Eleanor could see the strain of the past 2 weeks written in the tight line of her shoulders, the careful way she held herself, as if sudden movements might shatter whatever fragile control she'd managed to maintain. David emerged last, his posture carrying an authority Eleanor hadn't seen since he was a teenager, defending a friend from playground bullies. This was her son, but not the conflict-avoidant man who had let this crisis spiral beyond anyone's control. Something fundamental had shifted in the hours since Lily's play. "Grandma Eleanor?" Lily's voice was small but hopeful. "Daddy said we could come see your pictures, the ones you've been fixing." Eleanor knelt to Lily's eye level, her earlier panic attack making the movement more difficult than usual. "Yes, sweetheart. I've been working very hard to fix the pictures. That got hurt." "Can you tell me stories again, even if some pictures are broken?" The simple question cut through weeks of strategic thinking and emotional complexity to reach something essential. A 6-year-old who needed connection to her family history more than she needed the adults in her life to resolve their conflicts. Perfectly. "Yes," Eleanor said, surprised by the certainty in her voice. "Stories don't disappear when pictures get damaged. They just need different ways of being told." As they settled into Eleanor's living room, the full scope of her restoration project became visible to her family for the first time. Every surface held photographs in various stages of recovery. Some had been successfully restored, looking almost as crisp as they had decades ago. Others showed the careful work of conservation, water stains that couldn't be removed but had been stabilized, tears that had been mended with archival tape, images that would never be perfect but had been preserved as completely as possible. The dining table held Eleanor's most ambitious project, a large album she'd been rebuilding page by page, reorganizing family chronology from the scattered fragments she'd salvaged. Wedding photos, baby pictures, holiday celebrations, quiet moments of ordinary life that had become precious in retrospect. Vanessa moved toward the table slowly, her expression shifting as she understood the magnitude of what Eleanor had been attempting. "You've been doing all this? For 2 weeks?" "Longer," Eleanor said quietly. Some of these photographs needed extensive restoration work. The water damage was significant. Vanessa picked up a wedding photo that Eleanor had spent hours carefully drying and flattening. The image showed Eleanor and Robert cutting their cake, both of them laughing at something just outside the frame. Despite the water stains that had created a sepia effect around the edges, their joy was unmistakable. "I remember this from your wedding album," Vanessa said softly. "David showed it to me when we were first dating. He said his parents had the kind of marriage he hoped to have someday." Eleanor felt Marcus's presence behind her. He'd remained during the family arrival, perhaps sensing that this conversation would need witnesses who weren't caught in the emotional crossfire. His hand touched her shoulder briefly, offering support. Without intrusion. "That album was in the garage bags," Eleanor said simply. "Most of it was too damaged to save." The silence that followed was broken by David clearing his throat. "Mom, before we go any further, I need to say something. All of us need to understand exactly what happened here and why." Eleanor watched her son position himself at the center of the room, his usual tendency to hover at the edges of difficulty. Conversations replaced by something that looked like leadership. "2 weeks ago, my wife threw away 40 years of family photographs without consulting anyone," David said, his voice steady but carrying weight that made everyone in the room go still. "My response was to try to smooth things over without addressing the fundamental problem. Mom's response was to withdraw completely from our family system to teach us a lesson about consequences." He looked at each person in turn, Eleanor, Vanessa, even Lily, who was listening with the intense focus children bring to adult conversations they sense are important. "All of us made choices that hurt other people. All of us prioritized our own needs over family connection. And the person who paid the highest price was Lily, who lost her connection to family stories, lost her regular time with her grandmother, and spent tonight crying because she thinks the adults in her life have stopped loving each other." Lily's lower lip trembled at David's words, and Eleanor felt her heart constrict at the visible evidence of how their adult conflict had wounded the very person they were all trying to protect. "But tonight ends the blame and starts the solutions," David continued. "Because I'm not letting my daughter grow up thinking that love is conditional on perfect behavior, or that family connections can be discarded when they become inconvenient." Eleanor studied her son's face, seeing Robert's determination combined with something uniquely David's, a gentleness that refused to sacrifice people for principles. "Eleanor," David said, turning to face her directly, "I need you to tell us exactly how you've been feeling since Sunday night. Not the strategic version, not the lesson-teaching version. The truth about what it did to you to see those photographs in garbage bags." Eleanor felt the careful emotional control she'd maintained for 2 weeks begin to crack under her son's direct attention. Around her, the restoration project that had consumed her days and nights stood as evidence of grief transformed into methodical action. "It felt like being erased," she said quietly. 40 years of marriage to your father, 36 years of being your mother, 6 years of being Lily's grandmother, all of it reduced to clutter that was taking up too much space." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "But it wasn't just about the photographs themselves. It was about the assumption that my attachment to family history was excessive, that the stories I've been keeping for all of you were somehow neurotic rather than necessary." Eleanor looked at Vanessa, who was holding the wedding photograph with hands that shook slightly. "I've been your family's historian for decades. I remember which Christmas Lily first walked, which birthday David lost his first tooth, what your father looked like holding his grandson for the first time. When those photographs got thrown away, it felt like someone had decided that my role in this family was disposable too." Vanessa set down the photograph carefully, as if it might shatter, under too much pressure. "Eleanor, I never—" "That wasn't what I meant to do." "But it's what you did," Eleanor said gently, "whether you meant to or not." David moved closer to his wife, his hand settling on her shoulder with protective instinct. "Vanessa, it's your turn. We need to understand. What was driving your decisions? Not just the surface explanations about minimalism and storage space." Eleanor watched Vanessa struggle with the vulnerability of honest disclosure, her usual professional composure warring with the need to explain trauma she'd spent years trying to manage privately. "I grew up in a house where things mattered more than people," Vanessa said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "My father saved everything. Newspapers, broken appliances, clothes that didn't fit, food that was spoiled. The house was so full of his collections that there wasn't room for living." She looked around Eleanor's restoration project with an expression that mixed understanding with old fear. "My mother and I spent years trying to create small spaces where we could exist among all his things. The kitchen table where we could eat if we moved stacks of magazines. The couch where we could sit if we relocated boxes of parts from broken radios he was going to fix someday." Lily had moved closer to her mother during this explanation, perhaps sensing emotional pain even if she couldn't understand its source. Vanessa's arm came around her daughter automatically, the protective gesture of someone who knew what it felt like to be a child caught in adult dysfunction. "When I moved out for college, I swore I would never live surrounded by things again. Every object in my space would have a purpose, a place, a reason for existing. I would have room to breathe." Eleanor felt pieces of a puzzle she'd been trying to solve for 3 years finally clicking into place. Vanessa's insistence on minimalist decor, her anxiety when Lily's toys accumulated in common areas, her need to control the visual environment of their home, all of it made sense through the lens of childhood trauma. "But family photographs aren't the same as broken radios," Eleanor said carefully. "I know that now," Vanessa replied, tears starting to track down her cheeks. "But when I saw all those albums taking up space in our closets, when I thought about the stories and obligations and expectations they represented, they felt overwhelming in the same way my father's collections did." Sarah, who had been quietly observing from Eleanor's kitchen doorway, stepped forward with the measured pace of someone who had been waiting for the right moment to contribute essential information. "Vanessa never told you about the photographs, did she?" Sarah addressed Eleanor directly. "About what happened to our family pictures when her father's hoarding got completely out of control." Vanessa went very still, and Eleanor saw David's protective instincts sharpen as he recognized territory his wife hadn't shared even with him. "Mom," Vanessa said quietly, "they don't need to know." "They do need to know," Sarah interrupted gently, "because understanding changes everything." Sarah moved to the center of the room with the natural authority of someone accustomed to being the family's emotional navigator during crises. When Vanessa was 15, her father's hoarding became dangerous. Fire hazard, health department, violations, neighbors complaining about rodents. We had to move out for 3 months while a cleaning service dealt with the house. Eleanor watched Vanessa's face close down, the protective mechanism of someone revisiting trauma she'd worked hard to overcome. "Everything got thrown away," Sarah continued, "including boxes of family photographs that had been buried under newspapers and broken furniture for years. Pictures of Vanessa's childhood, our extended family, my parents who had died the year before. All of it went into dumpsters because it couldn't be separated from the garbage." The revelation hit Eleanor like physical force. Vanessa hadn't just been managing space anxiety when she'd discarded the family photographs. She'd been reenacting her own family trauma, taking control of a situation that had once left her powerless to protect what mattered. "So when you saw all those albums in our closets," Eleanor said slowly, understanding dawning, "they represented potential loss rather than preserved memory." Vanessa nodded, unable to speak through tears that had been building for weeks. "And throwing them away felt like taking control rather than allowing chaos," Eleanor continued. "I thought if I made the choice myself, if I decided what stayed and what went, I could prevent the kind of loss that happened when I was 15, Vanessa managed. I didn't realize I was creating exactly the same kind of loss for someone else." David moved to kneel beside his wife's chair, his face showing the shock. of someone learning that the person he'd married had been carrying trauma he'd never suspected. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked gently. "About your family photos being lost?" "Because I didn't want you to think I was damaged," Vanessa whispered. "Because I thought I had it under control. Because I was embarrassed that I couldn't separate reasonable space management from childhood trauma responses." Eleanor felt her anger of the past 2 weeks transform into something more complex, understanding mixed with sadness, recognition, of shared loss complicated by the need for healing rather than blame. "Vanessa," she said quietly, "I've spent 2 weeks teaching you about loss by creating more loss. That wasn't wisdom. That was just adding more damage to an already wounded situation." Lily, who had been listening to adult confessions with the solemn attention children give to conversations they sense are reshaping their world, spoke into the emotional heaviness with 6-year-old directness. "Are we still a family? Even though everyone is sad and some pictures got broken?" The question cut through layers of adult complexity to reach something essential. Eleanor looked around her living room, at the restoration project that had consumed her grief, at the family members who had each been trying to manage pain in ways that had inadvertently created more pain, at Marcus standing quietly in the background as witness to a conversation that was finally addressing root causes rather than surface conflicts. "Yes, sweetheart," Eleanor said, her voice carrying certainty that surprised her. "We're still a family. Families aren't perfect, and sometimes we make mistakes that hurt each other. But being family means working together to fix what's broken, instead of giving up when things get difficult." She looked at each adult in turn. David, who was learning to lead rather than avoid. Vanessa, who was finally sharing trauma instead of managing it alone. Sarah, who understood the complexity of preserving culture while building new traditions. "But fixing what's broken is going to require different choices from all of us," Eleanor continued. "I can't withdraw from family connection every time someone makes decisions I don't like. Vanessa can't manage trauma by controlling everyone else's relationship with memory. David can't avoid conflict and expect problems to resolve themselves." Marcus stepped forward slightly, his presence reminding Eleanor that healing required witnesses who could offer perspective without agenda. "What would different choices look like?" David asked. Eleanor studied the restoration project around them, photographs that would never be perfect but had been preserved as completely as possible. Family history that had been damaged but not destroyed. Evidence that some things were worth the patient work of repair. "They would look like compromise," she said slowly. "Like finding solutions that honor both the need for preserved memory and the need for manageable space. Like building trust instead of teaching lessons. Like choosing connection over being right." She looked directly at Vanessa, who was still, holding the wedding photograph with careful hands. "And they would look like asking for help when trauma makes it hard to make decisions that protect relationships, instead of recreating old wounds." The conversation that followed wasn't easy, but it was honest in ways that Eleanor hadn't experienced since Robert's death. Each person took responsibility for their role in escalating conflict. Each person acknowledged pain they had caused, and pain they had experienced. Each person committed to choices that would prioritize family connection over individual comfort. As the evening progressed, Eleanor realized that the space she had created through withdrawal was finally being filled with something more substantial than absence. The possibility of a family system built on understanding rather than assumption, on conscious choice rather than unconscious reaction, on love that was strong enough to survive imperfection. Some spaces, she was learning, could only be closed through the courage to be vulnerable with people who had the power to hurt you, and the wisdom to choose healing over being right. Some spaces, she was learning, could only be closed through the courage to be vulnerable with people who had the power to hurt you, and the wisdom to choose healing over being right. The first sign that something fundamental had shifted came 3 days after their family confrontation, when Eleanor's doorbell rang at 9 a.m., and she opened it to find Vanessa standing on her porch with a cup of coffee and what appeared to be a carefully prepared presentation folder. "I've been thinking," Vanessa said without preamble, her professional composure tempered by something that looked like nervous determination. "About solutions. Real ones, not just apologies." Eleanor invited her in, noting how Vanessa's eyes moved immediately to the restoration project that still dominated her living room. But instead of the anxious avoidance Eleanor had expected, her daughter-in-law's expression showed genuine interest, the focused attention she usually reserved for client challenges that required creative problem-solving. "I stayed up until 2 a.m. researching photograph preservation and digital archiving," Vanessa continued, opening her folder to reveal printed articles, cost estimates, and what looked like preliminary design sketches. "I think I understand now what I destroyed, and I want to help fix it properly." Eleanor accepted the coffee, a peace offering that felt more significant than grand gestures, and settled beside Vanessa on the couch to examine the research she'd compiled. Professional photo scanning services can digitize everything without further damage, Vanessa explained, her marketing background evident in the thoroughness of her preparation. High-resolution files that preserve every detail, cloud storage for security, multiple backup systems. It's not cheap, but it's comprehensive. Eleanor studied the cost estimates, impressed despite herself by the scope of Vanessa's investigation. "This would be several $100s. "Which David and I will pay for," Vanessa said firmly. "All of it. It's the least we can do after." She gestured toward the water-damaged photographs Eleanor had been painstakingly restoring by hand. Eleanor felt something ease in her chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but recognition that Vanessa was approaching repair with the same systematic intensity she'd once applied to decluttering. The same trait that had caused the problem was now being directed toward solutions. "But digitizing solves the preservation issue, not the space issue," Eleanor said carefully. "Physical photographs will still take up room in your house." Vanessa's expression brightened with the enthusiasm of someone who had anticipated this objection. "That's where the rotating display system comes in. Look at this." She pulled out sketches that showed elegant wall-mounted frames designed to hold interchangeable photographs, monthly rotations featuring different family themes, holidays, birthdays, everyday moments. A system that would keep family history visible without overwhelming Vanessa's need for controlled visual space. Lily could help choose which photos to display each month, Vanessa continued. She'd learn the stories behind them, understand her connection to family history, but the overall visual impact would remain manageable. Eleanor studied the designs with growing amazement. This wasn't just problem-solving. This was creative collaboration that honored both their needs while creating something neither could have achieved alone. "You've put considerable thought into this," Eleanor said. "I had to," Vanessa replied. Simply. "I saw what my trauma did to your family history, and I saw what my need for control did to Lily's connection to her grandmother. I couldn't live with either of those consequences." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of small feet running up the porch steps, followed by David's deeper footsteps moving at a more measured pace. Lily burst through the front door with the enthusiasm of someone who had important news to share. "Grandma Eleanor, Mommy said you and her are going to work together to fix all the pictures and make them live in computers and on walls." Lily's excitement made the complex technical process sound like magical transformation. "Can I help?" "I know lots of stories about the pictures." Eleanor felt her heart expand at her granddaughter's enthusiasm. "Yes, sweetheart, your help would be very important. You're the only one who remembers all the stories we used to tell." David appeared in the doorway, his expression showing relief mixed with cautious optimism. "Mind if I join this planning session? I'd like to understand what you're proposing." As they spread Vanessa's research across Eleanor's coffee table, Eleanor realized they were creating something unprecedented in their family system. A collaborative solution that required input from multiple perspectives, rather than one person making decisions that affected everyone else. The scanning process will take several weeks, Vanessa explained to David. Professional services batch process photographs to prevent handling damage. While that's happening, we can design the rotation system for the house and start organizing photos thematically. What about the albums that were completely destroyed? David asked. The wedding album? Some of Dad's military photos? Eleanor felt the familiar pang of grief for images that couldn't be recovered. But it was tempered now by the collaborative energy building around what could be preserved and honored. We create new albums, she said slowly, the idea forming as she spoke. Not replacements for what was lost, but new collections that tell family stories through the photographs we've saved. Different organization, different focus, but the same core purpose, helping Lily understand where she comes from. Lily clapped her hands together with 6-year-old delight. Like storybooks, but with real pictures of our family. Exactly. Like storybooks, Eleanor agreed, warming to the concept. Albums organized around themes instead of chronology. One about family celebrations, one about everyday moments, one about the places where we've lived and traveled. Vanessa was already taking notes, her project management skills automatically organizing the concept into actionable steps. We could create both physical albums for hands-on storytelling and digital presentations for preservation. Best of both worlds. As they worked through the morning, Eleanor found herself genuinely enjoying Vanessa's company for the first time since David's wedding. Her daughter-in-law's marketing background brought strategic thinking to family memory preservation, while Eleanor's librarian experience provided organizational expertise that made the project feel manageable rather than overwhelming. I have an idea, Vanessa said around noon, when they'd filled several pages with preliminary plans. What if we make this a weekly project? Saturday mornings, all of us working together on photograph organization and storytelling? Lily gets consistent. Time with family history. I get controlled exposure that helps manage my space anxiety. You get collaborative support instead of doing restoration work alone. Eleanor considered the proposal, recognizing how it addressed everyone's needs while creating new patterns of family connection. That could work, if you're sure you can handle regular exposure to large quantities of photographs. I'm starting therapy next week, Vanessa said quietly, specifically to address trauma responses around objects and control. I think working on this project while getting professional support could actually be part of healing rather than something I have to manage despite my anxiety. David had been listening to their planning with increasing amazement. You two have accomplished more collaborative problem-solving in one morning than our family has managed in 3 years. Crisis has a way of clarifying priorities, Eleanor said. Sometimes you have to nearly lose something to understand its true value. Vanessa looked up from her notes with an expression that combined gratitude with determination. Eleanor, I want you to know that I understand what I almost destroyed. Not just the photographs, but Lily's connection to family history, your role as family historian, the continuity that holds families together across generations. She paused, clearly choosing her words carefully. I grew up thinking that holding onto things was dangerous because my father's hoarding taught me that objects could take over your life. But watching you restore damaged photographs for weeks, seeing how you've preserved 40 years of family stories, learning about your work. As a librarian, I understand now that some things deserve to be preserved not because they take up space, but because they create meaning. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at Vanessa's words, recognizing the courage it took to acknowledge such fundamental misunderstanding about something so central to Eleanor's identity. And I understand now that teaching lessons through withdrawal doesn't build understanding, it just creates more distance, Eleanor replied. I should have asked for help rather than assuming you couldn't learn to value what I valued. Lily, who had been quietly working on a drawing while the adults talked, looked up with the directness children use when they want to contribute something important to grown-up conversations. Are you friends now? Like real friends, not just family friends? Eleanor and Vanessa looked at each other, both recognizing that Lily's question went to the heart of what they were building together. Working partnerships could exist without genuine affection, but the kind of collaboration they were planning would require something deeper: actual trust, mutual respect, shared investment in outcomes that benefited the whole family rather than individual preferences. "I think we're learning to be friends," Eleanor said carefully. "Real friendship takes time to build, especially when it starts with misunderstanding. But we're both willing to do the work." "Good," Lily said with satisfaction, "because friends help each other, and our family needs lots of help fixing all the sad things that happened." As David prepared to leave with his family, he lingered in Eleanor's doorway with the expression of someone who wanted to address something that had been weighing on him. "Mom, I want you to know that I've made an appointment with a therapist too. Rebecca recommended someone who specializes in family systems and conflict resolution." His voice carried the vulnerability of someone admitting to fundamental skill deficits. "I need to learn how to engage with family conflict instead of avoiding it. My conflict avoidance didn't protect anyone. It just made everything worse." Eleanor felt a surge of pride in her son's willingness to address patterns that had been decades in the making. "That takes courage, sweetheart. I watched you and Vanessa solve in 3 hours what I've been avoiding for 3 years, David said. "I realized that my idea of keeping peace was actually preventing the kind of honest communication that builds real stability." After they left, Eleanor sat in her living room surrounded by restoration work that would soon become collaborative. Family project, feeling something she hadn't experienced since Robert's death. Anticipation for the future rather than just preservation of the past. Marcus found her there an hour later, humming softly as she organized photographs into the thematic categories she and Vanessa had discussed. "Good morning?" he asked, settling beside her on the couch. "Surprisingly good," Eleanor replied, showing him Vanessa's research and planning materials. "We're building something new instead of just trying to restore what was damaged." Marcus studied the designs and cost estimates with the appreciative attention of someone who recognized systematic problem-solving when he saw it. "This looks comprehensive and expensive." "David and Vanessa are paying all the costs," Eleanor said, "but the real investment is time and emotional energy. Weekly family meetings, collaborative storytelling, shared responsibility for preserving family history." "How do you feel about that level of ongoing engagement?" Marcus asked gently. After weeks of withdrawal, this represents quite a shift toward intensive family involvement. Eleanor considered the question, recognizing that Marcus was helping her examine whether this new approach was sustainable or just another extreme swing in the opposite direction. "It feels right," she said slowly. "Not because it gives me everything I want, but because it gives everyone something they need. Vanessa gets manageable space and professional support for her trauma. David gets clear expectations instead of conflicts he has to navigate alone. Lily gets consistent access to family stories, and I get collaborative partnership instead of feeling like the only person who cares about family continuity." Marcus smiled, his expression showing both affection and admiration. "It sounds like you've learned to build bridges instead of walls." Eleanor leaned against his shoulder, comfortable with the physical affection that had developed gradually over the past month. "I had a good teacher. Someone who helped me understand the difference between consequences that punish and consequences that teach." As evening settled over the neighborhood, Eleanor realized that the space she had created through systematic withdrawal was finally being filled with something more substantial than absence: collaborative partnership, shared responsibility, and the kind of love that was strong enough to survive imperfection and grow stronger through honest work. Some bridges, she was learning, could only be built by people willing to meet each other halfway. Some bridges, she was learning, could only be built by people willing to meet each other halfway. The first official family story time took place on a Saturday morning in November, 6 weeks after the night when Eleanor's living room had become a battlefield of damaged photographs and difficult truths. The intervening weeks had been filled with the careful work of rebuilding, professional photo scanning, therapy appointments, tentative conversations that gradually became easier, and the slow establishment of new patterns that honored both memory and space. Eleanor stood in David and Vanessa's living room, admiring the rotating display system they'd installed the previous weekend. Elegant black frames lined one wall, currently featuring photographs from Lily's early childhood, her first steps, birthday celebrations, quiet moments of everyday joy that had once seemed ordinary, but now carried the weight of preserved memory. The display was beautiful without being overwhelming, sophisticated enough to satisfy Vanessa's aesthetic needs while maintaining the warmth that made family photographs meaningful. "Grandma Eleanor, look!" Lily bounced on the couch with 6-year-old excitement, pointing to a photograph of herself as a toddler sitting in Eleanor's lap, both of them focused intently on a picture book. "That's us reading stories together, and now we're going to tell stories about the pictures." Eleanor settled beside her granddaughter, holding the tablet that contained their digitized family archive. Months of restoration work had been transformed into searchable, categorized files that could be accessed without risk of further damage to the originals. It was technology serving memory rather than replacing it, a compromise that neither Eleanor nor Vanessa could have achieved alone. "What story should we start with today?" Eleanor asked, scrolling through albums organized by theme rather than strict chronology: celebrations, everyday moments, family milestones, places they'd lived and visited. "Tell me about when Daddy was little like me," Lily requested, the same request she'd made dozens of times when they'd looked through physical albums that no longer existed. Eleanor selected a photograph of 3-year-old David on Robert's shoulders, both of them grinning at the camera during what looked like a summer picnic. But instead of the simple storytelling that had characterized their old routine, Eleanor found herself weaving a richer narrative that included context. Lily was finally old enough to understand. "This was taken at the park where Daddy learned to ride his bicycle," Eleanor began. "Grandpa Robert had been working with him for weeks, running alongside the bike until Daddy felt confident enough to ride alone. But what you can't see in this picture is that Grandpa's back was hurting that day from all the running and bending over." She paused, looking at Lily's attentive face. "Do you know why he kept helping even though his back hurt?" Lily shook her head, absorbed in the story. "Because sometimes love means doing things that are hard for you because they're important for someone else." Grandpa Robert knew that learning to ride a bicycle would give Daddy confidence and independence, so he was willing to accept some discomfort to help that happen. David, who had been listening from the kitchen where he was making coffee, appeared in the doorway with an expression that mixed surprise with recognition. "I never knew his back was hurting. He never said anything." "Your father was good at that," Eleanor said gently. "At carrying difficulties quietly so they didn't become burdens for other people. It was one of his strengths, though sometimes I wished he'd shared more of what he was feeling." Vanessa looked up from her laptop, where she'd been organizing the next batch of photographs for display rotation. Her therapy sessions had been helping her tolerate increasing exposure to family photographs without overwhelming anxiety, and she'd begun contributing her own memories to their storytelling sessions. "I remember David telling me about learning to ride his bike," Vanessa said. "How patient his father was, how he never made David feel rushed or pressured. David said he wanted to be that kind of parent someday." Eleanor felt warmth spread through her chest at Vanessa's contribution, not just the acknowledgement of Robert's parenting, but the inclusion of her own relationship with David in the family narrative. These sessions were becoming collaborative storytelling rather than one-way transmission of family history. "And now Daddy is teaching me to ride my bike the same way," Lily added with satisfaction. "He runs next to me even when he gets tired, just like Grandpa Robert did." Eleanor scrolled to another photograph, David at age 5, carefully feeding ducks at a pond while Robert crouched beside him, both of them focused on the task with identical expressions of concentration. "This one shows something else about your daddy," Eleanor continued, See how gently he's holding the bread? Even as a little boy, he was careful not to frighten the ducks or throw the food too hard. He's always been someone who thinks about how his actions affect others. Is that good or bad? Lily asked with the directness that made adult conversations both easier and more challenging. Eleanor considered the question carefully, aware that David was listening and that her answer would shape how Lily understood one of her father's defining characteristics. It's good when it helps him be kind and considerate, Eleanor said. But sometimes caring too much about not upsetting people can make it hard to speak up when something important needs to be said. The trick is learning when being gentle helps relationships and when being quiet hurts them. David moved to sit beside his daughter, his expression showing recognition of the lesson embedded in Eleanor's storytelling. Like when I should have protected Grandma Eleanor's photographs instead of staying quiet to avoid conflict. Exactly like that, Eleanor agreed. Sometimes protecting people we love requires having difficult conversations rather than avoiding them. Their storytelling session was interrupted by the doorbell. Eleanor glanced at her watch, 10:30 a.m. earlier than expected but not unwelcome. She'd invited Marcus to join them for the second half of their family morning, a gentle introduction that would let everyone adjust to his presence without the pressure of formal announcements. That's probably Marcus, Eleanor said, noting how Lily's eyes lit up with curiosity while Vanessa and David exchanged glances that suggested they'd been expecting this development. Eleanor had been preparing for this moment for weeks, not just the practical aspects of introducing Marcus to her family, but the emotional complexity of opening her heart to new love while maintaining her central role as family historian and grandmother. At 68, after 40 years of marriage to Robert, the possibility of romantic partnership felt both thrilling and terrifying. Marcus appeared in the doorway a moment later, carrying a bakery box and wearing the slightly nervous expression of someone meeting a girlfriend's family for the first time in decades. Eleanor felt a flutter of affection at his obvious effort. He'd dressed carefully in slacks and a button-down shirt that brought out the silver in his hair, and he'd clearly given thought to an appropriate contribution to their family gathering. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet Marcus Williams," Eleanor said, her voice steadier than she'd expected. "Marcus, this is my son David, my daughter-in-law Vanessa, and my granddaughter Lily." Lily studied Marcus with the intense scrutiny children reserved for adults whose role in their lives was still being determined. "Are you Grandma Eleanor's boyfriend?" Eleanor felt her cheeks warm at Lily's directness, but Marcus handled the question with the grace of someone who understood that children required honest, age-appropriate answers. "I'm Grandma Eleanor's friend," he said simply. "A special friend who cares about her very much and enjoys spending time with her." "Do you like stories and pictures?" Lily asked, clearly applying her own criteria for evaluating potential family additions. "I love stories and pictures," Marcus replied. "Grandma Eleanor has been showing me some of your family photographs, and I've been learning about what a special family you have." David stood to shake Marcus's hand, his expression showing cautious approval mixed with protective instinct. "Mom's mentioned you. Thank you for being such a good neighbor during everything that's been happening." "Your mother is remarkable," Marcus said simply. "I'm grateful she's let me be part of her life." Vanessa looked up from her laptop with the evaluative expression she used when meeting new clients, friendly but assessing, making judgments about character and intention that would inform future interactions. "Eleanor says you're a grief counselor," Vanessa said. "That must be challenging work." "It can be," Marcus agreed, settling into the chair Eleanor indicated. "But it's also meaningful work. Helping people navigate loss and rebuild connection, there's nothing more important than that." Eleanor watched her family's interaction with Marcus, noting how naturally he fit into their Saturday morning routine. He listened attentively to their storytelling, contributed observations that showed genuine interest rather than polite obligation, and treated Lily with the respect that children recognized and appreciated. When Eleanor showed him the photograph of Robert teaching David to ride a bicycle, Marcus studied it with the careful attention of someone who understood the weight of family memory. "You can see the patience in both their expressions," he observed. "The way they're both completely focused on the learning process rather than rushing toward the outcome." "That's exactly what I was trying to tell Lily about her grandfather," Eleanor said, pleased that Marcus had identified the same qualities she'd been highlighting. "And it's exactly the approach you've been taking with family healing," Marcus added gently, "focusing on the process of rebuilding trust rather than rushing toward resolution." Eleanor felt something settle into place at Marcus's words. Recognition. That he understood not just her individual personality, but her role within her family system. He wasn't trying to replace Robert or compete with her family obligations. He was supporting her ability to maintain those connections while also building something new with him. "Marcus helped me understand the difference between consequences. That teach and consequences that punish," Eleanor told her family. "His perspective was essential during the hardest parts of working through our difficulties." David's expression showed genuine gratitude. "Then we owe you thanks. Mom's wisdom saved our family, but I'm glad she had support while she was figuring out how to help us." As their morning progressed, Eleanor found herself relaxing into the pleasure of having Marcus integrated into family time rather than compartmentalized from it. He admired Vanessa's rotating display system, asked thoughtful questions about David's photography hobby, and won Lily's complete approval by listening to her elaborate explanation of why certain family photographs were her favorites. "I think this tradition is going to work very well," Vanessa said as they prepared lunch together in the kitchen. "Lily loves having dedicated story time. The rotation system keeps the visual impact manageable, and everyone gets to contribute to the family narrative." Eleanor watched Marcus help Lily set the table, both of them discussing the proper placement of napkins with mock seriousness that made Lily giggle. "I think you're right, though I suspect it will evolve as we all get more comfortable with the new patterns." "Speaking of new patterns," Vanessa said carefully, "how are you feeling about including Marcus in family activities? I know it must be complicated, balancing a new relationship with your role as grandmother and family historian." Eleanor appreciated Vanessa's thoughtful question, recognizing how much their relationship had deepened through the process of collaborative problem-solving and mutual vulnerability. "It feels right," Eleanor said simply. "Marcus understands that my family is central to who I am. He's not asking me to choose between him and you. He's asking to be part of supporting the connections that matter most to me." Vanessa nodded, her expression showing understanding that came from her own experience of building family relationships that honored individual needs while creating shared connection. "That's what healthy partnerships look like," she said. "Addition rather than substitution, integration rather than replacement." Their conversation was interrupted by David's voice from the living room, where he was showing Marcus their family photo archive on the tablet. "Mom, you need to see this. Marcus found something in the digital files that the scanning service missed." Eleanor and Vanessa joined them to find Marcus holding the tablet, displaying a photograph that Eleanor hadn't seen in years, Robert and David at ages that made Eleanor's breath catch. David was perhaps 8 years old, Robert in his early 40s, both of them working together on what appeared to be a treehouse construction project. "It was misfiled under Miss Construction Projects," Marcus explained. "But I recognized David from other photographs and thought you might want to include it in the family story collection." Eleanor took the tablet with hands that trembled slightly. The photograph showed Robert patiently teaching David to use a hammer, both of them absorbed in the shared project with expressions of concentration and joy. It was exactly the kind of image she'd thought was lost forever when the water damage had destroyed so many family albums. "I remember this day," David said softly. "Dad spent the entire weekend helping me build that treehouse. I thought I was helping him, but really he was teaching me about planning and patience and working with your hands. And now you're teaching Lily the same lessons when you work on projects together?" Eleanor observed, seeing the continuity that connected generations through shared activities and patient instruction. Lily studied the photograph with interest. "Daddy, you were little like me, and Grandpa Robert was teaching you just like you teach me." "That's right, sweetheart," David said. "That's how families work. We learn from the people who came before us, and then we share what we've learned with the people who come after us." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at the perfect circle of family continuity captured in one recovered photograph. But these weren't tears of grief for what had been lost. They were tears of gratitude for what had been preserved, what had been rebuilt, and what was continuing to grow. As their afternoon wound toward evening, Eleanor realized that they had successfully established something unprecedented in their family system. A tradition that honored both preservation and change, that included multiple perspectives and experiences, that created space for growth while maintaining connection to the past. "Same time next month?" David asked as they prepared to leave. "I'll have the December photographs ready for rotation, holiday pictures from when I was growing up." "Same time next month," Eleanor agreed. "And Marcus, you're welcome to join us regularly if you'd like. You're part of this family now, if you want to be." Marcus's smile showed both gratitude and understanding of the significance of Eleanor's invitation. "I'd be honored to be part of your family traditions." After everyone had left, Eleanor and Marcus sat together on her couch, surrounded by the digital files and planning materials that represented months of collaborative family work. "How does it feel?" Marcus asked gently. "Having successfully established new patterns that include everyone's needs?" Eleanor considered the question, thinking about the journey from that devastating Sunday night, when she'd discovered garbage bags full of family photographs, to this afternoon's collaborative storytelling session that had engaged 3 generations in shared memory-making. "It feels like healing," she said finally. "Not like forgetting what happened or pretending the damage wasn't real, but like building something stronger from the broken pieces." Marcus took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in the gesture that had become natural over the past months. "And how does it feel to include me in family time? I know that was a big step." Eleanor turned to face him, seeing in his expression the same patient attention he'd shown during her crisis weeks, the same willingness to support her choices without trying to control them, the same understanding that love meant addition rather than replacement. "It feels like the future," she said simply. "Like there's still room in my life for new love while honoring old love, for new traditions while preserving family history, for growth that doesn't require giving up what matters most." As darkness settled over the neighborhood, Eleanor realized that the space she had created through systematic withdrawal had been transformed into something she couldn't have imagined during those weeks of restoration work. Room for her family to grow stronger through honest communication, room for her own heart to open to new love, room for traditions that honored both continuity and change. Some traditions, she was learning, were worth the patient work of creation rather than just preservation. Some traditions, she was learning, were worth the patient work of creation rather than just preservation. 1 year later, Eleanor stood in David and Vanessa's kitchen at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, making coffee while Sarah Chen sat at the breakfast table in her robe, looking frailer than Eleanor had ever seen her. The call had come 3 days earlier. Sarah had collapsed at her accounting office, dehydration and exhaustion from what doctors suspected was early-stage kidney disease, requiring careful monitoring and significant lifestyle changes. Eleanor might have waited for an invitation to help. The old Vanessa might have tried to manage the crisis alone, rather than accept support that would disrupt her carefully controlled household routines. But the year of collaborative family work had changed both women in ways that were now being tested by genuine crisis. "I still can't believe you talked me into this," Sarah said softly, accepting the coffee Eleanor offered. "Moving into my daughter's house at 63 feels like admitting defeat. Moving in with family when you need support feels like accepting love," Eleanor corrected gently. "There's a difference." Eleanor watched Sarah's expression shift as she processed this reframing. The same kind of perspective. Adjustment that had taken Eleanor months to develop during her own crisis the previous year. The woman who had once been politely distant during family gatherings had become, through necessity and choice, someone Eleanor considered a genuine friend. Vanessa appeared in the kitchen doorway, her hair in a messy ponytail, and her expression showing the strain of 3 days spent reconfiguring her household to accommodate her mother's needs. But instead of the anxiety Eleanor might have expected from someone whose space was being dramatically altered, Vanessa moved with the purposeful calm of someone who had learned to distinguish between changes that threatened core stability and changes that required temporary flexibility. "How did you sleep, Mom?" Vanessa asked, settling beside Sarah with her own coffee. "Better than expected," Sarah admitted, "though I kept worrying about disrupting your morning routines." "Morning routines can adapt," Vanessa said simply. "What matters is that you're getting the care you need while your doctors figure out the best long-term treatment plan." Eleanor felt a surge of pride at Vanessa's response, recognizing how much growth it represented. A year ago, the idea of her mother moving in temporarily would have triggered panic about lost control and disrupted order. Now, Vanessa was approaching the situation with the same collaborative problem-solving skills she'd developed for managing family photographs and holiday traditions. "Besides," Vanessa continued, "Lily is thrilled to have Grandma Sarah here for her birthday weekend. She's been planning all the stories she wants to share during our family story time." As if summoned by mention of her name, Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway wearing her favorite pajamas and carrying the small digital camera Eleanor had given her for documenting their monthly family gatherings. At 7, she had become the family's official photographer and assistant historian, roles she took seriously. "Grandma Sarah, can I take your picture for our birthday album?" Lily asked with the directness that had become more confident over the past year. "I want to remember this visit." Sarah's expression softened as she looked at her granddaughter. "Of course, sweetheart, though I'm not very photogenic in my bathrobe." "Grandma Eleanor says the best pictures show people being real, not just looking perfect," Lily replied, already adjusting her camera angle with the seriousness of someone who had learned to see photography as storytelling rather than just documentation. Eleanor felt warmth spread through her chest at Lily's words, recognizing her own teaching reflected back, but transformed by a child's understanding. The monthly story times had indeed evolved beyond simple memory preservation into collaborative, family narrative creation, with each generation contributing perspectives that enriched the whole. David appeared as Lily was taking Sarah's photograph, his expression showing the relief of someone who had learned to engage with family crises rather than avoid them. Over the past year, his therapy sessions had helped him develop communication, skills that made him a more effective support system during challenging times. "How's everyone adjusting?" he asked, settling into the domestic scene with the ease of someone who had learned that family connection required presence rather than perfect solutions. "Better than expected," Eleanor answered. "Sarah's doing well with the temporary arrangement. Vanessa's managing the household changes beautifully, and Lily's documenting everything for our family archive." "And you?" David asked his mother directly. "How are you handling the extra family logistics?" Eleanor considered the question, noting how naturally she'd stepped into a support role without feeling either taken for granted or overwhelmed by obligation. The year of establishing new family patterns had created space for her to contribute meaningfully without sacrificing her own needs or autonomy. "I'm handling it the way families handle things," she said simply. "Together, with clear communication, about what each person can offer and what each person needs." 2 days later, Lily's 7th birthday party showcased everything their family had learned about creating traditions that honored both continuity and change. The dining room table held both old and new photographs, images from previous birthday celebrations, alongside pictures from the past year's family story times, Sarah's recent visit, and Lily's growing collection of everyday moments she'd decided were worth preserving. Eleanor sat between Sarah and Marcus, watching 4 generations of women collaborate on birthday storytelling. Vanessa held the tablet containing their digital archive. Sarah contributed memories from her own childhood celebrations in Taiwan. Lily provided commentary on which photographs were her favorites and why, and Eleanor wove connections between past and present that helped everyone understand the continuity that made individual moments meaningful. "Look at this one," Lily said, pointing to a photograph from her 6th birthday party, the celebration that had taken place just weeks after Eleanor's systematic withdrawal had ended. "Everyone looks happy, but I remember we were all still learning how to be family again." Eleanor studied the image Lily had selected, seeing what her granddaughter meant. The smiles were genuine but careful, the body language showing affection mixed with uncertainty about newly established boundaries and expectations. "And now look at us," Lily continued, gesturing around the current gathering where conversation flowed easily, where Sarah's presence felt natural rather than disruptive, where Marcus was included without question, where Vanessa managed multiple generations in her home with grace rather than anxiety. "What's different?" Eleanor asked, genuinely curious about Lily's perspective on family change. "We all know how to help each other now," Lily said with 7-year-old wisdom. "And we know how to ask for help when we need it. And we know that being family means making room for people, not just for things." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at Lily's observation, recognizing the profound truth her granddaughter had articulated. The crisis that had begun with discarded photographs had ultimately taught them all the difference between space as emptiness and space as room for growth. As the evening wound toward its close, Eleanor found herself surrounded by evidence of successful family evolution. Sarah was thriving with the support system they'd created around her health needs. Vanessa had demonstrated that managing space anxiety didn't require perfect control, but rather collaborative flexibility. David had learned to engage with family challenges rather than avoid them. Lily was growing up understanding that family connection required conscious choice and ongoing effort. And Eleanor herself had learned that love could expand to include new relationships without diminishing existing bonds, that family roles could evolve without losing their essential meaning, that the space between people could be filled with understanding rather than distance. Marcus found her as she was packaging leftover birthday cake, his presence as natural now as it had been tentative during those first family gatherings a year ago. "Reflecting on how far everyone's come?" he asked gently. Eleanor looked around the kitchen where 3 generations of women were collaborating on cleanup with the easy efficiency of people who had learned to share domestic space without territorial conflict. "Reflecting on how space can hold love instead of just things," she said. "How families can create room for growth instead of just room for storage." As they prepared to leave, Lily ran to Eleanor with a wrapped package that clearly contained a photograph in a frame. "I made this for you. Grandma Eleanor. It's for your collection, but it's new instead of old." Eleanor unwrapped the package to find a photograph Lily had taken during their most recent family story time. 4 generations of women sitting together on the couch, looking at photographs on the tablet, their faces showing the comfortable engagement of people who had learned to create meaning together. "It's us making memories instead of just keeping them," Lily explained. "I thought you should have a picture of that." Eleanor pulled her granddaughter into a hug, breathing in the familiar scent of strawberry shampoo and birthday cake, feeling the weight of family continuity that connected her to Robert's memory, to her son's future, to traditions both preserved and newly created. The photograph Lily had given her would join the thousands of other images in their family archive, but it would represent something unprecedented in their collection. Not just a moment preserved, but a family transformed. Not just space created through separation, but space filled through connection. Some circles, Eleanor realized as she prepared to go home to Marcus, were worth the patient work of completion, rather than just preservation. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.